It was a usual flight for Japan Airlines. Flight 123 took off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport on a clear, sunny day, heading for Osaka. The passengers settled in, some reading, others dozing off, completely unaware that their world was about to turn upside down. But just 12 minutes into the flight, something catastrophic happened. The plane's tail suddenly ripped apart, sending shock waves of panic through the cabin. What followed was a horrifying series of events that no one on board could have ever imagined. What caused the worst single air crash in history? How did a routine flight turn into a deadly disaster? Stick around, because we're about to reveal exactly what happened on that fateful day. This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123. The day seemed like any other. It was August 12, 1985, and summer in Tokyo was in full swing. Hot, humid, and buzzing with life. At Haneda Airport, the terminals were filled with the usual noise of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and families saying goodbye. Businessmen hurried through the gates. Tourists snapped photos, and children clung to their parents, excited for the short hop to Osaka. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was parked and preparing for departure. The plane that would later become part of Japan's worst air disaster was a Boeing 747 SR-46 with the registration JA8119. It was delivered to Japan Airlines in 1974 and had been flying for over 10 years. By 1985, it had completed more than 25,000 hours in the air and nearly 19,000 flights. It was specially designed to handle Japan's busy domestic routes with more seats and heavier loads. That day, Flight 123 was making a short trip from Tokyo to Osaka, a flight that usually took less than an hour. It was the fifth flight of the day for this aircraft. On board were 15 crew members, 3 in the cockpit and 12 flight attendants. The cockpit had Captain Masami Takahama, 49 years old, a veteran with over 12,000 hours of flying, mostly in 747s. But today, he wasn't flying. He was supervising. First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, 39 years old, was in control of the flight. He was in training to become a captain and was being evaluated. Flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, 46 years old, had almost 10,000 flight hours and knew this aircraft well. On this flight, there were 509 passengers, including 22 people from other countries, from the US, the UK, India, and more. Most were Japanese traveling during the Obon holiday, a time when families returned home to honor their ancestors. Among them was Kyu Sakamoto, a beloved Japanese pop singer known worldwide for his hit song, Sukiyaki. The plane landed at Haneda Airport in Tokyo at 5:12 p.m. after arriving from Fukuoka. It stayed on the ground for almost an hour. At 6:04 p.m., the plane pushed back from Gate 18. 8 minutes later, at 6:12 p.m., it took off from runway 15L, 12 minutes behind schedule. 12 minutes after takeoff, at 6:24 p.m., the plane was flying near its cruising altitude over Sagami Bay, just a few miles off the coast. Suddenly, it suffered a rapid decompression. The rear section of the plane was torn apart. The ceiling around the rear lavatories collapsed and the vertical poyavilis, tail fin, broke off. All 4 hydraulic lines were severed. The pilots quickly set the transponder to emergency and contacted Tokyo Air Traffic Control. Captain Takahama declared an emergency and asked to return to Haneda. They were cleared to turn east toward Oshima Island for an emergency landing, but as the plane began turning, something was wrong. The captain noticed the aircraft wasn't responding properly to the controls. The control wheel wasn't working, and the autopilot had disengaged. The flight engineer reported that hydraulic pressure was dropping fast. Captain Takahama asked the co-pilot to turn the plane back, but nothing worked. The plane was no longer responding. The pilots had lost control. Hypoxia was likely setting in, a lack of oxygen at high altitudes. The captain and co-pilot kept asking if they had lost hydraulic pressure but seemed confused. Finally, the captain confirmed, "The aircraft is now uncontrollable." At 6:31 p.m., the plane passed over the city of Izu. It also began Dutch rolling, swinging left and right in a yawing and banking motion. At times, the plane rolled sharply up to 50 degrees side to side. The crew kept trying to fly the aircraft. They pulled on the control column, moved the rudder pedals, and turned the wheel, but nothing worked. The plane remained at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet for about 18 minutes after the decompression. During this time, the pilots seemed disoriented, likely due to hypoxia. They never put on their oxygen masks, even after the flight engineer suggested it twice. When told the rear passenger oxygen masks had failed, the captain just said, "Yes," and continued flying. At 6:35 p.m., the flight engineer responded to calls from Japan Airlines headquarters using a backup communication system. He mistakenly believed a rear door had failed and said they were descending. Headquarters asked if they were returning to Haneda. He said they were making an emergency descent and to keep monitoring them. The pilots slowly regained some control by adjusting the engine power. This helped reduce the phugoid cycle and stabilize their altitude a little. They lowered the landing gear using an emergency system, which also helped calm the rolling and pitching, but it also reduced their limited control. Shortly after, the flight engineer asked if they should use the speed brakes, but no one answered. From 6:40 to 6:45 p.m., the plane made a slow descending loop over the city of Atsugi. They were now flying in a large right-hand turn due to uneven engine thrust. The aircraft dropped from 22,400 to 13,500 feet. At 6:45 p.m., the pilots again said the aircraft was uncontrollable, but now they were lower and breathing better. Their speech became more frequent, suggesting the hypoxia was wearing off. At 6:46 p.m., Captain Takahama said, "This may be hopeless." At 6:48 p.m., Flight 123 was barely hanging on. It was now flying low, way too low for the jagged mountains ahead. Inside the cockpit, alarms were still blaring. The captain made a bold move. He slammed the throttles forward, pushing the engines to full power. The damaged aircraft jolted upward, but just as quickly power was pulled back and the plane began to fall again. Moments later, more power was added, and this time the plane shot up at a steep 40-degree angle. It was climbing, but too steeply. The speed dropped fast, then came the terrifying stall warning. The plane was now on the edge of falling from the sky, with the stick shaker rattling the controls. The captain again screamed for full power. The plane managed to climb a little more, barely hanging on, trying anything to stabilize the jet. The crew began lowering the flaps using backup systems since the hydraulics were gone, but this would take time, and time was running out. The plane had reached 13,000 feet. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might escape the mountains. The captain radioed, "Uncontrollable aircraft." One more time. The ground controller asked them to switch frequencies. They did, but said nothing. Seconds later, Tokyo reached out again, and this time the flight engineer responded. The crew asked, "Where are we?" They were told 4 miles northwest of Haneda and heading the wrong way. However, things started to unravel. The imbalance caused by uneven flaps made the plane tilt dangerously to the right. On top of that, the engines on the left side were now producing more power than the ones on the right, pushing the plane even harder into a roll. The bank angle grew worse, and the nose started to drop again. Panic set in. However, some minutes later, they managed to level its nose, but it was too late. Still in a hard right bank, the number 4 engine slammed into a tree-covered ridge. Then the right wing clipped another ridge. The wing tore apart. 2 engines broke off and tumbled down the mountain. The aircraft flipped upside down, struck a 3rd ridge, and exploded in a fireball. A seismograph in Tokyo picked up the shock waves. The final crash happened at 6:56 p.m., just 32 minutes after the rear of the plane tore open in the sky. Share it with others who need to know the truth behind this tragedy. And if you're new here, subscribe for more real stories from the skies. So, the crash had already happened. The world didn't know it yet, but 520 souls were gone, most of them instantly. Some, heartbreakingly, were still alive. At Yokota Air Base, just 40 miles away, American military personnel picked up the emergency calls. A U.S. Air Force C-130 was already in the air and spotted the wreckage within 20 minutes of the crash, while it was still daylight. The crew immediately radioed the coordinates to Japanese authorities. A rescue was ready to launch, helicopters, medics, everything. But then the call came: abort the mission. The Japanese government said no, they wanted to handle it alone. So the American rescue team stood down. They watched, they waited, but they were never called. As the sun disappeared, a Japan helicopter finally spotted the wreckage, glowing faintly in the darkness near Mount Takamagahara. But the terrain was brutal, steep, rocky, dangerous. The pilot couldn't land. From above, he saw no movement, no signs of life. That one report sealed the fate of many. No rescue team was sent that night. Instead, JSDF forces camped 63 kilometers away, setting up tents, prepping gear, building landing pads, while in the cold mountains, people were still alive, still waiting. When rescuers finally reached the crash site the next morning, it was too late. Medics discovered the truth. Some passengers had survived the initial impact, but they died in the night from shock, blood loss, cold. Injuries that could have been treated if help had arrived just 10 hours earlier. Only 4 people survived this flight, all women, all sitting in the rear left part of the plane. One was Yumi Ochiai, an off-duty flight attendant. Another was Hiroko Yoshizaki, a young mother, and her 8-year-old daughter, Mikiko. The fourth was Keiko Kawakami, just 12 years old, who lost her parents and sister in the crash. Take a moment in the comments to honor the 520 lives lost. Just writing "rest in peace" can be a small way to remember them. Now the main question was, how could this happen to a plane with no warning at all? On June 19, 1987, the truth finally came out. The official report from Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission revealed something almost unthinkable. The crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 didn't start in the sky. It started 7 years earlier on the ground. Back in 1978, the same aircraft, flying as JAL Flight 115, suffered a tail strike while landing at Osaka International Airport. The impact seriously damaged the aft pressure bulkhead, a critical part that keeps the aircraft sealed and pressurized at altitude. Boeing issued clear repair instructions: 1 continuous splice plate, 3 rows of rivets, no shortcuts. But that's not what happened. Instead of following Boeing's design, the repair team cut corners, literally. They used 2 separate splice plates placed parallel to the crack. It may have looked okay from the outside, but internally, it was a ticking time bomb. That botched repair reduced the bulkhead's strength by 30%. And worst of all, the defect was invisible during inspections, hidden behind overlapping metal plates. Investigators later calculated that this flawed repair could handle around 11,000 pressurization cycles. Flight 123 had flown 12,318 times since then. The clock had quietly run out. On that fatal evening, the weakened bulkhead finally gave in. It ripped open at 24,000 feet, triggering a catastrophic decompression that tore off the aircraft's vertical stabilizer and severed all 4 hydraulic systems. And it all traced back to a single mistake, buried under metal and forgotten paperwork. 1 wrong repair, 1 missed detail, 520 lives lost. In the end, human error and a series of poor decisions led to one of the deadliest crashes in aviation history. If you want to continue exploring the stories of the skies, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, and stay tuned for more real aviation stories that demand to be heard.